Okay, welcome everyone. It is now 11:30 and we're going to go ahead and begin with our webinar, In the Red, Drawing the Line on Digital Redlining Practices. We'll go ahead and we'll start with introductions. And so I'll go ahead and begin. My name is Michelle Martinez Vega. I'm the Chief Technology Strategist at IDRA. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Cristina Quintanilla Munoz and Thomas Marshall III. And so we'll go ahead and I'll pass it off to Cristina and she can introduce herself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Michelle. We're really excited for everyone here. And then those of you who are joining on our Facebook Live, I'm Cristina Quintanilla Munoz. I'm the research analyst here at IDRA. And I'm also currently a doctoral student in applied demography at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So thank you again for joining us to learn more about digital redlining and the implications of it on education. And I'll pass it off to my colleague, Thomas.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's early morning. My name is Thomas Marshall III. I'm the Policy Communication Strategist here at IDRA, and I work on digital equity issues with IDRA, and we're going to be talking about some digital literacy things, the homework app, as well as digital redlining. So I'll pass it back over to Michelle.
All right, I see that we have some really awesome attendees. And I see that we have some of our old friends, Samantha Boisier, I see you, and I see Brian Dillard. So I'm so happy that you guys have joined us. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started with the first part of our presentation, which is a little bit a deep dive into digital redlining, and Cristina will take that. Go for it, Cristina.
Absolutely. Yes. Hi to everyone who's joining and is continuing to join. So yeah, just to kind of start with a brief history and more of a deep dive really on the context of digital redlining. So here on the screen, you'll see a definition of what digital redlining is by Bill Callahan, a researcher with Ndia. In 2017, he defined it as income-based discrimination against residents of lower income neighborhoods in the types of broadband service that major ISPs offer and in their investment in improved services. But more specifically, digital redlining is the practice of creating and perpetuating inequities between already marginalized groups, specifically through the use of digital technologies, digital content, and the internet. And more broadly, it's the practice of these major network providers in systematically excluding the low-income neighborhoods from broadband service, deploying really only substandard or low-speed home internet. And on the next slide, you'll see that the map created by Bill Callahan in 2017 with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, they investigated the digital redlining of Cleveland, Ohio, for first conducting a map analysis of Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, broadband availability data, which strongly suggested that major ISPs or internet service providers systematically discriminate against lower income neighborhoods across Cleveland in providing the home internet and other broadband technology services. And this research shed a new light on these nefarious practices by ISPs to withhold investment in less affluent residential neighborhoods by failing to provide upgraded technologies and services. And as a consequence, residents in these areas either had slow, choppy, unreliable connectivity or none at all. And since the study, Ndia has produced and highlighted research on digital redlining for various other cities, which include Detroit, Toledo, and Dallas. But to kind of deep dive into the map that you're seeing here, the map pictured here demonstrates the troubling pattern of systemic failure of major for-profit ISPs to invest in robust broadband infrastructure that's really required to provide equitable access to the internet for residents, particularly those in lower income cities. And according to the map here, 55% of Cleveland census blocks in 2017 were reported by major ISPs to have a max download speed no greater than 6 megabits per second, which, if we're translating, is actually a really mediocre connection offered by these service providers that lacks the bandwidth to support the activities that are needed for business, health, or education related purposes. And this particularly has been shown during the COVID pandemic, where many of us had to work from home, our students had to attend school from home, and often we noticed that our connectivity was poor or wasn't capable of providing the same connection that we normally are used to because the bandwidth was so low. And on the next slide are actually more historical maps that show redlining practices that are traced back to the New Deal era. And so when during the Great Depression, the US government aimed at evaluating the risk associated with mortgages, which has since left American housing scarred with structural segregation and discriminatory practices and economic inequality, such as what you saw in the previous map. So here, this slide presents two figures. One on the left is Atlanta, Georgia, and then the figure on the right depicts the map for Decatur, Illinois. And these maps are what are known as residential security maps. These were created for major cities in the United States during this time. And they showed the property or the city color-coded by this federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. And this was a way for HOLC to evaluate the mortgage lending risk of these particular areas. So this assessment followed in response to the increased urbanization of American cities during the late 1930s to 1950s. And in general, residential neighborhoods were considered high risk or hazardous, which you can also see colored here in red on these residential security maps. They were redlined by lending institutions, denying the families in these regions access to the capital investment necessary that held potential to improve housing and economic opportunities for these residents and their families. And on the next slide, I will actually introduce first this really amazing project by the University of Virginia's Digital Scholarship Lab, and then I'll do a brief demonstration of that interactive tool. But this project is called Mapping Inequality, and it's a really great way to see the redlining's legacy on major cities within the United States. So again, this project was led by the University of Virginia's Digital Scholarship Lab, and it features redlining maps, such as the ones you saw on the previous slide, that were developed by HOLC in the late 1930s, overlaid on these contemporary city maps. So you can see kind of the legacy that redlining has created for these cities. And so I can take you there. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right. And here we are. Is everyone can see that okay? Great. So here is this really interesting interactive tool. So what you'll see here is the map of the contingent United States, and you will see these colored spots kind of scattered around the nation here. So the size of the circle represents the area of the city that HOLC assessed or graded. And then each color is relative to these here in the key. So the areas that are green were considered the best or more desirable areas for companies to invest in. Blue was still desirable, C was declining, and then D, here the red regions were hazardous. And so you'll notice that these circles also have different color proportions. So that is relative to the area of the city that's coded a certain way. So for example, here in Chicago, much more of the city was graded either declining or hazardous, and as we're comparing it to Omaha here, much more of their city was graded as desirable or best. So we can actually see on this interactive tool here, as I mentioned prior, that the HOLC assessment maps or residential security maps, and even further, you can actually investigate the areas and the demographics of these areas. So as a whole, in 1940, the population of San Antonio was a little over 250,000 residents, and you can see the demographic breakdown with about 81.1% of residents as native-born white, compared to 11% foreign-born white, and then 7.6% African-American. And so you can actually go through on some of these sites here, for example, Chicago. If we do a little deeper dive in the Chicago area, you can actually hover over some of these areas and take a look at some of these other descriptors beyond population. You can look at percentage of the residents who were African-American or Black, foreign-born. You can also see the class description of some of these areas, and then occupation. So this is a really neat tool if you're interested in learning more about the historical implications of redlining and how they are related to contemporary city or urban structures. So I just wanted to share that tool with you. And again, this was the Mapping Inequality site by the University of Virginia. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and then we can go ahead and resume our presentation. Thank you so much. So redlining practices today, overt redlining practices are illegal under the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So these discriminatory housing policies, though, have reverberated and have caused a very much chilling effect on neighborhood economic and racial ethnic composition and the wealth in contemporary society, particularly for urban areas. And then on the next slide, I highlight some research that was led by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, or the NCRC, that in 2018 examined how these redlined neighborhoods, their social and economic conditions compared with those labeled as desirable neighborhoods, if we're thinking about what they look like today. So the figure that you're seeing here displays regional Holk grades and current income by region. And if we notice here, if we're looking at the two sections to the right, declining and hazardous, you can see the percentage of those populations or those areas by Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. So it's by region. And you can see that many of the Northeast, yes, the Northeast have low to moderate income. Compared is also the low to moderate income for these hazardous. But if you notice, the West and Southern regions are on average much lower income that were graded at the time declining or hazardous. So according to NCRC's research, cities in the South and Midwest have the highest percentage of hazardous areas that are today low and moderate income, indicating that this inequity has persisted over the decades, although the practices are illegal. And on the next slide, you'll see the figure that displays Holk grades by current majority non-Hispanic white or majority other minoritized racial ethnic status. So in addition to the persistence of economic disadvantage, the southern cities have more areas that were evaluated hazardous and are now majority minority. So this suggests that the urban structure in the most segregated and economically disadvantaged southern cities has undergone much less change than other regions of the country, and further makes the case that homes found in these historically redlined neighborhoods are still worth less than homes found in non-redlined communities, and homes in these zones are most often owned by Black or Latino families who are also more likely to earn lower incomes. And we'll also talk about how that relates to broadband adoption on the next slide in a minute. But the main takeaway from this research is that first, economic and racial segregation created by these redlining practices in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s persist in many of these major cities in the United States. So 74% of neighborhoods that Holk graded as high risk or hazardous, which were also labeled in red on those residential security maps, are now low to moderate income today. Second, geographic areas historically marked as less desirable or hazardous have remained predominantly minoritized neighborhoods. And then greater economic inequality remains in these neighborhoods compared when you're looking to the Holk low risk areas, which have remained predominantly white. And then lastly, redline cities or greater residential areas as marked hazardous experience what's called residential segregation, where Black and Latinx residents are more clustered around these historically labeled high-risk neighborhoods. And on the next slide over, these illustrates the home adoption or home broadband adoption, as I mentioned prior, which varies across these demographic groups. So although these housing redlining practices were at the time relative to housing, we see that broadband adoption is very much correlated to these same neighborhoods. So these figures illustrate how it varies across demographic groups, where minoritized racial ethnic groups and residents with lower levels of education and income are less likely to have access to home broadband services. So these graphics were borrowed from Pew Research Center's 2021 report, which documents these disparities. So to kind of bring back to the point that the digital divide is not just limited to rural communities, right? Rural communities sure experience the poor broadband infrastructure. Residents in urban areas, however, bear the brunt of the systemic part of the issue. So in 2020, NDIA reported that according to the US Census ACS, or American Community Survey estimates, 14 million households in urban areas did not have broadband of any kind, which compares to 4 million households in rural areas. So often infrastructure is lacking or grossly outdated in pockets of cities where families who receive low income are, and where ISPs have failed to provide this last mile service. They consider it to be non-profitable or very low profit margin. So on the next slide, Overt explained that a little bit more. This is a really excellent quote by Miss Jenna Leventoff with 20th Public Knowledge Anniversary, who describes the responsibility of policymakers to address this issue, right? So commercial internet service providers, they still neglect historically redlined neighborhoods. Most ISPs contend that profit margins are narrow, providing services or upgrade services in these communities. So often they opt not to provide them at all. Digital redline communities receive lackluster services for often the same price. So non-high quality connectivity for the same expensive rates is a huge issue in these areas. Broadband providers can still provide services. They can still make a profit by upgrading broadband services in these neighborhoods where residents receive low incomes and in areas where infrastructure is outdated and dull. So to bring back the point that availability should not be the standard, is not the standard. In fact, broadband must be fast, reliable, affordable. And we've seen through the COVID pandemic that this has been urgently and abundantly clear that access to broadband is a social justice issue. It is a right, it's essential, and lack of it perpetuates these economic and social inequities. So I'll pass it off to my colleague, Michelle, so she can talk a little bit more about how the digital divide, how digital redlining has widened the homework gap for students in our nation.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was on mute. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the homework gap. And I'm going to start off by just doing a little vocabulary, right? So what is the digital divide? The digital divide is the gap between people who have access to broadband services and know how to use the internet, and those who do not have such access or knowledge. And then what is the homework gap? The homework gap is the difficulty that students experience completing their homework when they have no internet access compared to those who do have internet access. So what we're seeing on this slide is who's on the wrong side of the gap, right? So students from low income households, rural areas, those with parents who are less formally educated, and students of color tend to be on the wrong side of the gap. And according to a report from Common Sense and Boston Consulting Group, based on data from 2018 census, roughly 30% of the 50 million K through 12 students in the United States lacked either high-speed internet devices with the capacity that was needed for easy access to digital learning at home. Of these young people, nearly 2/3 lacked both high-speed internet and usable devices. Furthermore, at least 300,000 teachers lacked high-speed internet and internet that was adequate enough to teach from online home. So what does that tell us, right? So that basically tells us that students of color obviously are on the wrong side of the gap, and that even for teachers, so these are teachers that either live in rural or urban communities, that there are over 300,000 teachers that lack high-speed internet. So to teach from home, much less to learn from home, is still a huge obstacle. On the next slide, we see that we have on this table, and this was developed by the Pew Research Center, that students of color are disproportionately impacted by the lack of household internet service and household technology devices. Here we see that Black and Latinx and lower income students are more likely to use public internet and their cell phones to complete their schoolwork. The same students are also more likely to not complete their homework that requires internet access. So, this is one of those issues that once you get behind, then your buy-in to school, it diminishes, right? So if the students are being assigned homework that is online and they can't complete it, then their grades are negatively impacted, which negatively impacts their entire educational career. On the next slide, we see that how many students are actually impacted. So according to the most recent data from the National Center of Education Statistics, 14% of children ages 3 through 18 don't have internet access at home. More than 9 million school children will face difficulty completing assignments online. In addition to home internet, the lack of a laptop or a desktop computer also impedes schoolwork, right? So it's a barrier to full participation in remote learning. Among children ages 3 through 18, 17% live in households without a laptop or a desktop, and at least 11 million students don't have a computer for online learning at all. In addition to those that may need to share a single device with siblings, lack of home access or home internet or a computer increases for lower income students. So we see that 9 million students are having difficulty completing online assignments. That's a lot of students. On the next slide, we see that these are the worst connected cities. This is the top 20. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with the IDRA has an EAC, which stands for Equity Assistance Center, and we service the South. So ours is called the IDRA EAC South. And so we service from Washington, DC, down to Florida, over to Texas. And so when we look at the worst connected cities, we see that almost half of them are in our service area. And so I'll show you in a little bit where you can access the worst connected cities. But basically, these are households with no broadband access of any type, including a cellular data plan. And again, as we look at the 20 worst cities, we see that most of them are in the South. And when you look at the maps that Christina was showing earlier, the South is where the majority of Latinx and Black Americans live. And so we can see that correlation from the redlining maps that these cities and these states are still greatly impacted by digital redlining, and that they lack the infrastructure for broadband access. Okay, and so why does all of this matter? I'm going to show you guys a little video about why it's so important for students to have access to the internet. Do you have that, Thomas, or?
Yes, I do. I'm bringing it up now.
Okay, thank you. The sound's not on.
Let me see if I can get the sound to come on. Give me 1 second. Or would you like to share, Michelle, and see if you can get the sound to work?
Let's see here. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and share that. Okay, do y'all see the video? All right, awesome. Okay, let me go ahead and play it.
279.
That is correct.
How did they know this?
Are you kidding? Welcome to today's academic challenge. You may only use what's on your table. There will be 3 rounds, and the questions will get harder. What is the largest animal living today?
right.
Team A.
Blue whale.
Team B.
Blue whale.
That is correct. What is the square root of 144?
12.
12.
Correct again.
Go, Janine.
India.
India. Neil Armstrong.
Neil Armstrong.
William Shakespeare.
Correct. We are tied. For round 2, we're going to give both teams some additional resources.
Okay.
Who was the first president to live in the White House?
John Adams.
That is correct.
Oh my God, bro. Come on.
What does the acronym LCD stand for?
Wow. Just wow. Right?
Liquid crystal display.
Correct.
How did they know this?
Go with it. Just go with it.
Sargasso Sea.
That's correct.
8 minutes and 20 seconds.
Correct.
Samuel Morse.
Correct.
Denver, Colorado. Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Salt Lake City, Utah.
That is correct. Let's pull back the curtain.
Are you kidding me? That's so not cool. I'm offended that they had such an unfair advantage. It was way too fast.
Please have your team captain open the envelope on the table.
70% of teachers assign homework requiring access to the internet, and yet 5 million households with school-aged children do not have high-speed internet service at home. That just puts 5 million other people at a disadvantage, which is not okay.
Nearly 50% of students say they have been unable to complete a homework assignment because they did not have access to the internet or computer.
I didn't know that the percentage was so high. Everything he does is in the computer. So if he didn't have access to it, he wouldn't have a chance.
Someone may not be pulling the grade not because they're not smart, they just don't have access to what all the other kids have.
Okay, so I think it's obvious that over the past year, almost all of our lives have been conducted online. The census, schoolwork, most of that happened online, and those that do not have access to the internet are left out of these activities. We talk about Zoom fatigue, but Zoom fatigue is something that we have because we're blessed, because we have access to the internet. If you didn't have access, then you are totally disconnected. On this slide right here, what we see is that there was a San Antonio Express News article that shows that a lot of students, they face a myriad of issues when it comes to online education. The biggest of which, again, is internet access and devices. So this story follows a local family and the challenges that they face at home. While the district is doing everything that it can to assist this family, there are still obstacles that are just harder to overcome. There are 4 students in this family. Each of them has been provided with a Chromebook from their school district. However, they cannot afford internet access. Additionally, they have not been able to participate in the free local Wi-Fi internet services that providers are offering because of outstanding balances. So they will not turn on the service. Both parents work and the only Wi-Fi available is through the parent's cell phone, which the data runs out fairly quickly. And so all this is to say is that we as educators must understand that each child is faced with a different set of circumstances and that they have no control of it. And it's vital that we take these situations seriously and provide our students with resources that are going to best suit their needs. There's no silver bullet and there's no one-size-fits-all solutions, but we can be compassionate to our students and understand that if they don't have access, then we need to provide them with other alternatives to online school. On the next slide, I'm just going to kind of wrap this up. So what do students need, right? So they need access to fast and reliable internet service, devices, and digital literacy if they're to participate in online education effectively and safely. They need access to fast and reliable internet service. Cell phone data plans just don't cut it because of data caps. And if you have multiple students in your household, that data cap gets eaten really quickly. The students need access to devices, enough devices to accommodate each student in a household. It's not enough to have one computer in a household where there are multiple students and parents who need to access a computer for work and for school. And then lastly, students need access to digital literacy. Students need to learn about digital citizenship, misinformation, and their digital footprint. It's important to not only give them the tools, but also the training that will help them use their tools safe and effectively. And then on the next slide, I just want to briefly talk about what can be done to help. And so the IDRA EAC South, as we mentioned already, because we're part of IDRA, offers equity audits to school districts within its region at no cost. The IDRA EAC South region is a 12-state, as I mentioned before, that goes from DC down to Florida over to Texas. And equity audits are a systematic way to assess the degree of equity or inequity present within a school district. Schools and/or a district can conduct the audits to analyze their programs, the teacher quality, achievement quality, and digital equity. Audits are useful for school leaders responsible for measuring overall student achievements. If you're interested in doing an equity audit for your school district and you live within, or your school district is within the 12-state area of the IDRA EAC South, please let us know. Sylvia is going to be dropping in a link that'll give you information on how to get a hold of us. Teachers also can survey their students to discover who may or may not have internet access at home. I would suggest doing that anonymously. You wouldn't want to embarrass any of your students. And then this way, you know who needs homework alternatives when necessary. Schools can also allow students to use their Wi-Fi outside of school hours. I know rural districts are great at doing this, and what you'll see are students sitting in their parents' car turning in homework or things of like that nature. So, you know, it's not always possible for a student to get to a Starbucks or to a library, but if they can hang out after school and use the internet, then that's a great way that school districts can help. And then finally, schools should offer students a robust digital literacy curriculum. And this leads us to our next part of the presentation that Thomas will actually present, and he's going to talk about digital literacy. Take it away, Thomas.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much. Thanks for sticking with us so far throughout this presentation. I think Michelle and Christina's really set up well for what I'm going to talk about, how we kind of talk about a lot of the disproportionate effects and the historical effects of redlining that go into why we have the homework gap, unfortunately, in that really powerful video that Michelle shared. And then it kind of sets us up for digital literacy. And so what are some ways that we can attempt to counter these really systemic barriers and really look into how we reimagine what digital literacy can look like in our schools. So just to kind of set the stage, what is digital literacy? So digital literacy, we chose this definition from Common Sense Media, is the ability to navigate various digital platforms and understand and assess and communicate through them. Actually, me and Christina co-wrote a brief called Digital Destination. And we decided to use this term because it really served as a good umbrella to kind of understand everything that is within digital literacy. So the benefits of digital literacy, here I took these from the Digital Literacy for Texas. These are just a couple, but I like to start this part out with some experts may assume that there is this idea of a digital native. And so a lot of students and a lot of people that grow up within the age and kind of the boom of technology all know how to use technology, all know how to use phones and different things like that. Not saying it from a not asset-based perspective that students don't know how to use these things, but I think we make that assumption sometimes that everyone knows how to use a computer, for example. And so they may be familiar with the internet, but it's not always the case. Students who lack access towards different devices and computers may not understand how to use these resources. And so these are just a couple that I'm going to highlight, but there are many more I'm sure that we could all think of. So knowing how to use devices, even down to typing, using a mouse, navigating the internet and the device as just an operating system. Secondly, the ability to kind of create and communicate with tools such as presentations, different word processes, spreadsheets, things like that, as well as being a good digital citizen. And including that's understanding cyberbullying concerns and privacy concerns. I really like this last one, and I think sometimes we can also critique digital citizenship and think about what a good digital citizen is, because a lot of times in schools, due to fair use policies and things like that, if a student brings home their computer and a family member may need to use that to apply for a job or something like that, not all school districts are able to allow the free range of different websites, which of course we understand due to some privacy and security concerns. But how can we move to a place where digital citizenship is really for all, and we're accounting for families and communities that may be trying to access the internet as well. So on this next slide, I kind of go over creating the digital standard. So myself, Michelle, and Christina collaborated through some research and as well as worked with other digital equity advocates to kind of put together this internal framework of what we believe to be kind of some digitally literate skills. And so these are kind of some specifics of how students can learn these inside classrooms. And we decided to split it up over elementary, middle, and high schools. But we also encourage folks in the chat or over on the Facebook Live to think about what are some things that we're missing. There are a lot of different ways we're able to access the internet, and thinking about how we can best serve students in this way and thinking of new ways they're able to access. So on the elementary side, kind of those first basic skills that we talked about, thinking about keyboarding skills, typing, touchpad, even proper scrolling and kind of the things that go along with like moving the trackpad and mouse. All the way up to the basic search engine and having a good relationship with the internet. So thinking about what does digital health and wellness look like, and how can we make sure we're managing screen time and knowing when to take breaks and things like that. For the middle school level, we move into more of emailing, critical thinking skills, and how that can play a role in the ability to identify things like misinformation, credible sources online on the internet, as well as digital etiquette. So kind of speaking towards that, identifying cyberbullying and things around that. And the high school level, of course, we move to more some of the academic, towards academic writing and doing research and plagiarism, as well as really honing in on digital responsibilities. So what does it look like to have freedom of speech online, and identifying and reporting incidents of hate speech, which I'm going to get into a little bit later when we talk about kind of this idea of critical digital literacy. So how do we increase digital literacy for our Black and Latinx families and communities? I think Michelle and Christina really set this up well. It's important, of course, to think about our students, but how can we think about to support families and communities in their efforts to also navigate the internet? First off, state legislation. So here in Texas, the state legislator, a friendly representative at IDRA, was able to push forward a bill around digital citizenship and digital literacy in schools. So it was House Bill 129. It was authored by Representative Mary Gonzalez, and it would have created a digital citizenship curriculum that would have been a part of 6th grade social studies standards. So the curriculum would have included digital ethics, digital etiquette, media literacy, kind of how to have a good relationship with the internet, digital health and wellness, a lot of things that we've kind of unpacked and talked about on the previous slide. Unfortunately, in the really busy Texas legislature, it did not get passed, but it's not because of any opposition. It just didn't have enough steam to really make it over the finish line. I also go into here and I talk about digital literacy programming. It's really important that I kind of bring the digital literacy programming and the connectivity, kind of join them together, because bills, like I talked about previously, are really important and I think are a great step. But how can we think about those to include families in the digital literacy process? I think it's a huge part in how we engage with families and working on family leadership. That's something that we really take pride in here at IDRA and have developed some family leadership models. How do we ensure that digital literacy is a part of that, and making sure that families have the same access to this training as well? And of course, none of this can be done without a reliable connection. We really want to push forward and move past the kind of 25/3 threshold that you may have heard of before, and move to even 100/1 speeds, where you have a household of 4 people that need to do online work or remote learning on some days. You know, you have to really be able to think about the capacity that these thresholds can hold. And the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated and saw that, yes, hotspots may be a good temporary fix, but are not a long-standing issue for our students and families in their households. So when we think about what does this kind of have to do with the digital divide broadly, it's of course a part of digital inclusion, the digital divide, but a lot of times we'll hear about infrastructure issues as well as device usage. And so the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which we've referenced a lot here, they have a really lot of great resources to be able to think about how to think critically about digital inclusion and digital equity. Solutions for solving the digital divide are really more nuanced than we think. And so we have to ensure community members know how to confidently navigate our digital world, and think about what's being left out in these conversations. So recently, the American Rescue Plan funds had a funding source included, and it said assistance to households or populations facing negative economic impacts due to COVID-19. And so, of course, we all know this included housing help, this included rent, mortgage, food assistance, things like that. But they also had 2 lines that included internet access as well as digital literacy assistance. So when Ndia came out in May and kind of talked about how we can interpret some of these things, these are what they went over, how that we can cover the cost of a household's broadband services, providing outreach for low cost and subsidized broadband services, digital literacy training, like I've kind of gone over before, as well as things even going to purchasing devices for households. So a part of this American Rescue Plan and a part of the COVID-19 pandemic relief was the emergency broadband benefit. I'm not sure if everyone's heard of this before. It's still going on, actually. It provides a discount of up to $50 per month, based on broadband services for eligible households, and can be up to $75 per month for tribal lands. And so you are still able to navigate over to the Federal Communications website, or if you just Google search emergency broadband benefit, it'll take you there. The application is still up and is also in different languages if you need to pass that along to communities that may need that. It's a really important federal program, and we definitely believe and advocate that this should be something permanent. We should always have a government subsidy to be able to ensure that families and communities are able to have access to the internet, but not have to pay a lot of money for it as well. So we also need to recognize that digital literacy is intergenerational. Of course, we need more permanent funding for digital literacy training, but I think this slide really exemplifies the need for not only students, but for older folks as well, and our elders in our communities. An NDIA program field report actually came out with this, and this is where I was able to borrow this source from, and really talked about how elders were engaging in some digital literacy training and the impacts on them, being able to keep up with family members. Of course, we've seen in the COVID-19 ongoing pandemic, isolation has been a huge thing. How can we make sure that we are thinking about our loved ones and how we can make sure they're able to navigate the internet to still connect with us? So we really have to remember that it's not digital literacy, when we're talking about this training, it's not just exclusive to just an age group. And so as I begin to wrap up, I really like us to think about critical digital literacy. I think this is an emerging scholarship, this idea of critical digital literacy, and it talks about really the socio-political implications of digital literacy and what it can have. So our author here was able to really talk about an amazing concept that not only talks about just digital devices, but talking about how can we think critically about making connections between different relevant ideas, skepticism, understanding biases, and how social media can influence the world around us. So a lot of times we hear words like technology neutral, but that's not always the case. Technology neutral really dismisses the fact that technology was created in a society that we unfortunately know already discriminates people based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and national origin. And these same biases are reflected in technology that's made and usually end up favoring the white and wealthy. So the article goes over great examples of things like facial recognition not working for Black folks or darker skinned faces, as well as things like predictive policing systems that calculate where crime is most likely to occur, and then send police to discourage that. So which in practice is going to target our lower income and Black and Latinx communities. We also believed in looking at this from an asset-based lens, thinking of, we know students are already on different social medias and are already navigating the internet, and already understand the different algorithms that they're a part of. And so how do we make sure that we're understanding and thinking critically about the digital writings that students are participating in, and thinking about who this purpose serves and who it doesn't serve. So kind of seeing this connection when we're implementing a lot of these digital literacy trainings, we have to be critical and understand the ways that tech can be harmful for some of our most minoritized communities. I highly recommend works by Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She's a technology and race scholar that talks really more in depth about some of these issues, and thinks about how we can take a more abolitionist and anti-oppressive perspective for critical digital literacy. So I'm now going to navigate over to a really cool presentation software called Menti. We're going to do a little Q&A. So if you have a phone or internet device, I'm going to pull up the presentation in a second. We're going to ask the question, a pretty broad question that we'll ask is, what should digital literacy look like? So if you're able to take out your phone, even if you're on the Facebook Live, and scan this QR code, it'll take you over to the software. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then pull up the screen to be able to show us what the presentation is going to look like. All righty. So if you go over here, now you're able to see, you can also navigate on the website or enter the code. And so once we go over to this part, you'll start to see in real time some of your answers coming up. And if anyone's having any trouble, just let me know in the chat and I can be able to troubleshoot some of the things that's going on. But we really want you to think about this and kind of think about different ways we can implement digital literacy. So what does this look like on a state policy level? What does this look like in classrooms? What are a couple of things that we think that digital literacy could look like? So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to think about it, and then I'll kind of share out some of the responses as they come up. We've got a couple coming in. Thank y'all for participating already. I like these two. Really great being able to having this innate accessibility and understanding of digital devices, how this expands across all different of our ethnicity, orientation, age. Really important. I like this one that talks about should be available to all students, equitable access, the ability to perform common tasks. I think shopping, register to vote, those are really important. Those civic engagement things that we engage in are going to be very crucial for students learning. Tailored learning experience for different age groups. I think that's a really key point as well, something that we've seen in research, that it has to look different. Inclusive and community focused. That's really great. Ability to connect with friends, absolutely. Extend it to families in the broader community. I really like that. Of course, we are prioritizing students in our schools, but what does this look like for community-based practices? How do we extend this to our families and making sure that they're able to have that access as well? I'll give it a couple more seconds for anyone else who'd like to pop them into there and, you know, send it back over. And Michelle, to kind of wrap us up, and we're going to go over some resources. Robust programming and curriculum that meets students and families where they are. I think that's really, really, really good. Understanding how we meet students where they are. And notice the different capabilities that someone may know how to write an email may look different from someone that's had a computer at home. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing and then get back to our presentation. But thank y'all for participating. I always love a good interactive activity to kind of liven it up a bit. So I appreciate it. Now we're going to pass it back to Michelle, and she's going to start us off with some of the resources.
I'm going to actually share my screen if you don't mind, Thomas. Let's see here. Okay, so one of the resources that I wanted to point out is our digital destination. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so when you go to the IDRA website, which is idra.org, and Sylvia's already actually put this link in the chat box, what you'll see is our digital destination, and this talks about the brief that Thomas and Christina had mentioned that they co-wrote, and it also has some information about the Texas legislature and so on and so forth. So we invite you to go to this particular page to learn more about our research on the digital divide and broadband access. And so now we'll go back to the presentation. And then the next slide will actually talk about the NDIA worst connected cities. So if you are interested, and if you can actually click on that link, Thomas, it should take you to that page. Awesome. So if you're interested how your city fares, then you can go to the NDIA website, which is digitalinclusion.org. And as you scroll down, you'll get to a table, and this will show you all the cities that are considered that have the worst access. And so you can see where your city's at. You can click on any of the on the little dots, and it'll give you some information about households with no broadband internet. So this is a great resource for you to kind of start your research on what's going on in your city and in your location.
And then Michelle, really quickly, I did want to add something too, yes, if I'm able to, for the NDIA site. Another really recent and really informative tool is the Digital Equity Scorecard that NDIA has developed. So it's a way for you as a community member to see the extent in which your state or your particular area is addressing digital equity initiatives. So that was something that also might be a cool tool for you to try and check out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's also like, I'm thinking about San Antonio because that's where we're from. And so San Antonio has a Digital Inclusion Alliance, and it also has SA Digital Connects, right? And so that is the city and private partner endeavor to bridge the digital divide. But using that scorecard and using this resource will provide you with information on what's going on in your hometown. And yeah, if you scroll a little bit further down, You can actually keep going right there. You can actually filter out by state. So if you want to look at how the cities in your state fare, you can do that. And you can see exactly where they rank. So Thomas just did a sort for Texas. So we can see that FAR is in the Valley, and that is the #1 worst connected city. I know that there are groups that are trying to combat that, but right now FAR is definitely the worst, and we see that San Antonio ranks at 119. So again, if you want to see how your state cities are ranking, then you can use this tool. It's really awesome, and it definitely drives home what's going on in your area. And so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yes, so in the next slide, in Texas, a lot of the work that we did over the legislative session, because it just wrapped up over a couple special sessions, one of the biggest things out of it was broadband internet. It was really prioritized, and we really hadn't seen that in previous years. So the Texas Broadband Development Office came out of a bill called House Bill 5. It was a huge and impactful broadband bill that ended up having a lot of different things that Texas did not have previously. So everywhere from a statewide broadband plan that is in development to a statewide broadband office that will be able to address some of these low interest loans with internet service providers to be able to get internet and broadband access towards different parts of the state. Those are all different ways that bill went over. And so our advocacy behind that was making sure public education was at the center of a lot of these different broadband maps and a lot of the different broadband conversations, because we've seen it. We saw the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is affected and still affecting students with their capacity to be able to gain access to the internet. And so we were working with House offices and different folks like that to make sure that we had public education a part of this. And so when the broadband maps come out to try to see what are deemed underserved communities or communities who don't have enough access, every single school district, ISD, is going to be a part of that. And that's a really, really important piece of understanding who has access and how we're able to better assess and equitably, it is a very hard word to say, access data and things like that, and making sure that we're getting students and families the internet that they need. So if you'd like to figure out how you can find your own statewide broadband office, some really good key terms and words to search are broadband office with your state, as well as digital equity or digital inclusion search fields. You'll be able to really find out whether your state has a broadband office. But I think a really important point is thinking about how they approach this work, thinking about do they work with communities? Are they working with local digital inclusion alliances like Michelle alluded to earlier? Are they establishing this more of a public-private partnership? I think those are all really, really important things to be sure how your state is going to be approaching some of the digital divide work in their own state. And so yeah, Michelle and Christina, did you have anything else to add?
No, I don't have anything else to add. I don't know about you, Christina, but I know we are getting close to time. And so if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll definitely address them. As Christina, do you have any closing remarks?
One thing I did want to do just briefly is thank some people for inviting us to be part of the digital equity space. I know Thomas and I walked into this just wanting to know more, which you may be feeling right now. Just how do I learn more? How can I be a better advocate? So Michelle, for one, thank you for introducing us to what the digital divide is, how we can kind of advocate for our communities around it, but also Munita Jester with Ndia. She has been an incredible mentor to kind of guide us along our journey in understanding digital equity initiatives. And then also Renee Gonzalez here in San Antonio with Lit Communities has also been an awesome mentor along the way and kind of being better advocates. And so I do want to encourage you, if you're hungry to know more, or if you just want to find a place to start, definitely community groups and organizations in your area, see what they can help with in terms of getting you to get connected right away, getting you to be a better advocate in your own community, but also just to learn more about the issue itself. There are incredible researchers who are working on this work right now. And so I just encourage you just to dive deep into the data, dive deep into the research, and just ask your questions, because the community in general, the digital equity space, is very inviting and just willing to be collaborative. And that's something that I hope you can take away from our presentation.
Awesome. Well, it's 12:30 right now, so we understand if you have to drop off. Thank you so much for participating and joining us during this webinar. And we're going to stick around for a couple of minutes just to see if anybody has any questions. But again, thank you so much. You know, it takes a village, and it takes everyone working towards this problem to solve it.
Thank you for the information. I'm from San Antonio, and I appreciate the links you gave us, the websites, and I do plan to investigate it and find out more about the digital divide. I'm here in San Antonio, and thank you. Very informative.
Thank
Sure.
you, Ms. Kimborn.
Okay. Thank you.
See you.
Okay.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like there's any questions, so I'll go ahead and I'll close the meeting. Again, thank you so much for participating.